Hello, welcome to Philosophy Roulette number 154, where we read philosophy live and review it on the internet for everyone to find out what academic philosophy is like. And who knows who the everyone is? Maybe just me. And who knows if we find anything out. Anywho, I had some stuff that was saved. I was looking at some journals. I read something from the Journal of Speculative Philosophy the other day, and I had also found the Journal of Scottish Philosophy. And I figured, why not try something like that? So 16 pages. This one looks cool. And this one is, well, this looks historical. Let's see if there's anything else. American Indian Inferiority in Hume's Second Inquiry. And there's 3 pages, probably a review. Let's see here. That's always a auspicious start. Nope. Alright, so it's the other one, whatever that is. That, I believe, is the missing shade of blue. Let's see if it actually shows up now. That's terrible. Is there a search here? Because that would be way easier if I could just like search or something on this. Oh no. No, that's actually not so hard to do. Load, internet's load. Maybe academia is down for all I know. Yeah, so it says we got 28 papers here. It says not 28 papers. Do I have to like load more? Maybe academia is down or something. So that's unfortunate. Website. Here we go. Maybe we can just download it directly. Because who knows, right? Maybe this is more than one Earp. How could there be more than one Earp? There's one paper on being blue. And there we go. Alright, so. Although that was a little bit more exciting than I hoped, it was really less bad than it usually is. Quite often I have trouble finding papers to read. And I'm only a few minutes in, so here we go. 24 pages, and it's double-spaced. I love you. Okay. So. If you want to grab a copy of the paper, it'll be in the show notes below the video afterwards, once this is the broadcast is done, but otherwise you can come into the chat room and it'll be there. You can type exclamation point paper and the link will show back up. But without further ado, Introduction. One of Hume's central doctrines, defended at length in both a treatise of human nature and an inquiry concerning human understanding, as all mental perceptions fall into one of 2 categories: impressions or ideas. Very roughly, impressions are first-hand sensations or feelings characterized by their vivid liveliness or force with which they strike the mind, whereas ideas are typically less vivid thoughts drawn from memory or the imagination. These 2 classes of perceptions are related to each other in a very specific way, one that is important for the purposes of this essay. According to Hume, I will put some words in bold here to set up a later discussion. We shall always find that every idea which we examine is copied from a similar impression. This is the famous copy principle. He continues, those who would assert that this position is not universally true, nor without exception, have only one excuse me, I think the springtime allergens have kicked up around here. Without exception, have only one, and that is an easy method of refuting it by producing that idea which, in their opinion, is not derived from this source. So Hume rhetorically throws down the gauntlet, yet seems entirely confident that no worthy contender will be found in all the land. A mere 2 paragraphs later, a plot twist occurs. In a much remarked upon passage, Hume himself seems to produce such an idea, that is, an idea that is not in fact derived from a precedent corresponding impression, thereby apparently refuting his own position by the very criterion he had only a moment ago so explicitly laid out. The idea he produces is that of a missing shade of blue, MSB, the subject of an unforgettable thought experiment I will now reproduce. There is one contradictory phenomenon, Hume writes, which may prove that it is not absolutely impossible for ideas to rise independent of their corresponding impressions. His tentative or proposed proof is as follows. 1. I believe it will be readily allowed that the several distinct ideas of color by which enter the eye, or those of sound which are conveyed by the ear, are really different from each other, though at the same time resembling. 2. Now, if this be true of different colors, it must be no less of the different shades of the same color, and each shade produces a distinct idea independent of the rest. 3. Suppose a person to have enjoyed his sight for 30 years and to have become perfectly acquainted with colors of all kinds, except one particular shade of blue, for instance, which it never has been his fortune to meet with. Let all the different shades of that color, except that single one, be placed before him, descending gradually from the deepest to the lightest. Interestingly, this is actually something that, might actually occur nowadays, or maybe in some sort of weird situation, but it could actually occur. There's colors that screens do not produce very well, so if you haven't really gone out into like nature and other places, there are colors that are just unlikely to be seen because digital technology doesn't reproduce certain colors very well, and so it's like it just doesn't capture it. So maybe as the technology gets better, this will be less likely, but there definitely was at least a period where there's like some shade of like blue purple that was not captured on in digital media very well, so I just didn't see it, and then I saw a plant in that color and I was like, wow, I haven't seen that color in a while. 4. It is plain that he will perceive a blank where that shade is wanting, and will be sensible that there is a greater distance in that place between the contiguous colors than in any other color. 5. Now I ask whether it be possible for him, from his own imagination, to supply this deficiency, and raise up to himself the idea of that particular shade, though it had never been conveyed to him by his senses. 6. I believe there are a few, but will be of opinion that he can. This may serve as a proof that the simple ideas are not always in every instance derived from corresponding impressions. So I guess what Hume is saying is if you got like one color here on like the color wheel, and then one color here, but you've never seen the color in between, could you actually, like that, where that blank is, where that shade is wanting, could you fill in the gap? So there's different versions of induction, and being able to fill in a gap is one of them. So the concept of induction is different in different times. You might recognize the concept of induction as like you have a series, and then can you just induce across the whole series and just go up and say, well, holds generally. But there's a different sort of thing where if you have a sort of a discontinuity, can you make a smoothness if you in a discontinuity? Can you fill in all that space in between discontinuous data? Okay. So I think that's what's going on here. Notice the semicolon at the end of 6. So it's right here. Semicolon. This is the only pause Hume takes before dismissing the apparent proof he has just labored to provide as irrelevant to his broader project. Though this instance is so singular that it scarcely worth our observing and does not merit that for it alone we should alter our general maxim. We are now in a position to ask, what exactly is so odd about this argument, and why has it attracted so much commentary over the last 2.5 centuries, and then some? Yeah. The puzzle. In simplest terms, Hume seems to contradict himself. Not only that, he seems to contradict himself in broad daylight, as it were, over a very short stretch of text, while apparently being fully aware of it. There is one contradictory phenomenon. The oddness of the MSB, then, missing shade of blue, I take it is this. A. If one has just laid out a general principle couched in universal terms, we shall always find every idea universally true without exception, and especially if one has then gone on to state the precise conditions for a successful refutation of this principle, it should be perfectly damning to one's position if those conditions are in fact fulfilled. B. And yet, in spite of this, in spite of himself providing an example that appears to fulfill those refuting conditions, Hume blithely proceeds with his general principle as if nothing has happened. Moreover, he does so without so much as altering the principle in response to his refutation, and even more audaciously retains the place of this unaltered principle at the very foundation of his entire theory of human understanding. Given these 2 points, many interpreters of Hume, including H.A. Pritchard, the one-time White's professor of moral philosophy of Oxford, have called foul. The possibility of the imagined man's filling in the missing shade of blue by an act of his imagination, despite never having had corresponding, that is, immediate present sense of impression, Pritchard writes, is just the kind of fact which should have led Hume to revise his whole theory. Given his purported naturalist commitments, at least Eric Schleicher argues Hume ought to have embraced the Newtonian idea that even minor empirical exceptions to general rules should be investigated rather than dismissed, because they open up either possibility of discovering interesting refinements to general rules or the possibility of reformulating a more sophisticated new theory. As Pritchard continues, it is really effrontery on Hume's part not mere naiveness to ignore an instance so dead against a fundamental doctrine of his own. I'm finding recently, just in reading so much stuff, we all have such high opinions of ourselves. Don't cast the first stone, or was it like people in glass houses? It ain't like anyone else got everything right. You're gonna have to. Everyone deserves a pinch of salt, according at least Frege that asked for one. So you have to realize you're not gonna get everything everywhere. So in some sense, it's always a trade-off. So I have a little bit more sympathy for Hume than I think these other authors. I don't blame them for their criticism. He seems like Hume he left himself wide open for it, but still, a little bit of a charity goes a long way. What shall we make of the MSB then? Perhaps it was a fluke or an ill-considered move. Neither of these options seems likely. In fact, we can be confident that the MSB was no mere blooper, because Hume copies it word for word from the treatise and pastes it directly into his purported, more mature inquiries in a similar argumentative context. Hume did not slip up, therefore. He deliberately highlighted the MSB phenomenon, and this, in combination with A and B above, demands some kind of plausible explanation. Setting up an explanation in 2 constraints. In the latter portion of this essay, I will attempt to provide such an explanation. In doing so, I will be mindful of 2 main constraints whose violation, it seems to me, though potentially still compatible with my having offered an explanation, would render this explanation something other than plausible. The constraints I am thinking about are as follows. A. The carelessness constraint. My explanation must not rest on Hume's being careless, that is, thoughtlessly including a passage that directly undermines his entire theory. This is for the reason I have already given, namely, Hume's deliberate inclusion of the MSB verbatim in the inquiry, that is, his updated philosophical sentiments and principles, wherein some negligences in his former reasoning have been corrected. Another way of expressing this constraint is that my explanation must be compatible with Hume's having included the MSB for some reason, or to serve some purpose, presumably that is at least broadly consistent with his overarching aims. B. The contradiction constraint. My explanation must also not rest on showing or attempting to show that there really is no contradiction after all, that is, the MSB only appears to be a counterexample to the general maxim that all ideas are dependent on their corresponding impressions. At the very least, my explanation must contend that the possibility that Hume himself saw the MSB as genuinely contradictory phenomenon rather than a merely apparent one. Hey, and we're back to being a dialethist, as we were talking about last night. Hegelian-style dialethis, but dialethism nonetheless. How reasonable are these constraints? The first one, I take it, is uncontroversial. As I alluded to in an earlier footnote, however, there is an alternative reading of the relevant passages that might undermine constraint B concerning contradiction. Basically, the reading holds that Hume was admitting the possibility of a contradiction without committing himself to the position that he had in fact contradicted himself. In support of this view, Ken Winkler, in Personal Correspondence, offers the following observation. That contradiction may only exist between Hume's maxim and the phenomenon he imagines. If Hume thinks that his maxim is an empirical finding rather than a necessary truth, a matter of fact rather than a relation of ideas, we should expect that a counterexample would at least be conceivable. Thus, Winkler implies there may be no actual contradiction to contend with, and nor does Hume believe that there is, which would both explain and justify Hume's refusal to revise his maxim. Instead, there is only conceivably a contradiction, which is perfectly compatible with the empiricist gloss on the copy principle. To this I respond as follows. First, I don't think Hume saw the example as merely conceivable, but rather as something that, if the experiment were carried out, that as a man were raised in such a way that he encountered all the shades of blue except one, etc., would really be the case. My support for this is the detailed, almost literary narrative description Hume gives, really getting the reader to buy into the thought experiment and his resilient reliance on a merely unusual or unlikely rather than fantastical case. In other words, there are no unicorns or centaurs here, just an ordinary man with an ordinary life who happens not to have seen a particular shade of blue. And though it would, of course, be hard to prove empirically, at least with current scientific methods, unless it turns out there is a distinct and measurable neural signature associated with having the idea of a specific shade of blue, it really does seem like a real-life person, as described in the thought experiment, would be able to generate the missing shade of blue sight unseen. Yeah, see, this is the induction I was saying, right? Mentioning earlier, that you think you can fill in a gap in a continuous sort of series. If there's like a smooth transition and you're missing one of them, you think you can fill that in. And the question is, why do we think we can? Is that some sort of idealism? I don't know, but that's actually a reasonably difficult question. The induction between in a continuity. How do you fill in a continuous stuff in a series? So, but we think we can, and so there's something going on there. So this is what the author is saying here. Yeah, I don't know if I have anything else to say about that. I mean, the question is, how seriously are we taking Hume? How far are we taking Hume at his word? And it seems that the first argument from Winkler here is that maybe Hume was saying in the hypothetical case, and the author is responding, saying, well, it didn't look like you were saying that, and given the example, it seems like we should be able to do it. What Hume is saying, not only in the hypothetical case, in the mere conceivability. Yeah, if anyone has any questions out there, please let me know. I'll try to answer them. I have no idea if I can, but I will try. Second, even if we simply grant Winkler's reading, I believe there is value in exploring the consequences of maintaining constraint B, which at minimum attributes to Hume the belief that he had mustered a genuine counterexample to his own maxim. For one thing, other commentators such as Pritchard, quoted above, have not been so lenient on Hume, accusing him of real self-contradiction and hence intellectual negligence in failing to revise his whole theory. Indeed, as Don Garrett notes, such seeming contradictions suggest to many readers that Hume applies the copy principle both arbitrarily and unfairly, adopting it uncritically, insisting on it when it suits his purposes, and then allowing exceptions to it whenever he wishes. Given such widespread criticism, what I want to argue is that, even on the harsher interpretation, that is, even accepting the second constraint, Hume could still be justified in maintaining his given maxim given other resources he has made available to himself in his larger work. In other words, I want to see if, even if we make things as difficult for Hume as possible by imputing to him true self-aware self-contradiction, he can nevertheless legitimately parry the Pritchardian charge of effrontery. As we will see, I think he can. Okay, let's find out. a mechanistic detour. In order to show how Hume could successfully respond to Pritchard or Pritchard-like charges, I need to do some further setting up. In particular, I need to give an account of how precisely the crucial filling in of the MSB might happen that is consistent with the mental capacities Hume suggests would be available. So we should ask, how exactly does the man in the thought experiment from 6 above supply the deficiency and raise up to himself the idea of that particular missing shade of blue, though it had never been conveyed to him by his senses? Yeah, I'll tell you, that time, it was weird. I have that example of there's a flower that's like a purplish blue color, and it does not get captured by digital technology very well. Just our sensors, at least maybe now they're better, but at the time they were not that good to get that thing. And so I saw that flower, and I was like, wow, you just don't see that. It's like a periwinkle color somewhere. And it's like you don't see it. And I had a digital camera with me, and you hold the digital camera up with a little LCD screen, and the color of the flower on the LCD screen was clearly different from the color of the flower in real life. So it was like a periwinkle versus purple. And so it's like you could easily, like, I remember seeing this. It's like, and to tell you the truth, it really was a little bit of a shock to the system thing. I could have thought of that periwinkle color, but I had not seen it in so long, and if someone had asked me to come up with it, I actually don't know if I could have. Like, it's a weird thing. So let's see. Alright. One place to look for an answer is 3 paragraphs up, where we are told that all the creative power of the mind amounts to no more than the faculty of compounding, transposing, augmenting, or diminishing the materials afforded by us by the senses and experiences. As an example of this, we have in the subsequent paragraph the idea of God, which arises from reflecting on the operations of our own mind and augmenting without limit those qualities of goodness and wisdom which we find in ourselves. Thus, while it is quite likely and perhaps even impossible that we should ever have a direct impression of an infinitely intelligent, wise, and good being, we can arrive at the idea of such a being so long as 1. We have at least one direct impression of some degree of intelligence, wisdom, and goodness, and 2, we can augment that degree in our mind along a presumably continuous dimension of quality in question up to the level required for the target idea. So here we go. We got the continuity theory here. You can augment continuity in a continuous manner. You can fill in gaps. Don't know why we think we can do this, but we do somehow think we can do this. You can see where I am headed. These sorts of faculties, in particular, transposing and augmenting or diminishing, sound rather well suited, at least to my ears, to the very task we have in mind, namely the task of moving from the idea of one particular shade of blue, of which we have a direct impression, to the idea of a shade of blue immediately adjacent to that one in the relevant color spectrum, of which we do not have a direct impression. The sequence of mental activity would go like this. Please refer to figure 1. Ooh, a picture. I always like pictures. Individual distinct impressions of shades 1 to 3 and 5 to 7 are copied into the mind as ideas of shade 1 to 3 and 5 to 7. So where's shade 4? Oh my god. The idea of shade 3 is augmented or transposed up a step, resulting in an idea of shade 4, the missing shade. Alternatively, the idea of shade 5 could be transposed down a step, resulting in shade 4. Or even better, both the idea of shade 3 and shade 5 could be used as reference points in a kind of mental triangulation, closing in on the idea of shade 4 at the limit. Yeah, so everyone now imagine what color would be right in between shade 3 and shade 5. Have you got the idea fixed in your mind? Other mechanisms may be possible for us. For example, Garrett offers a slightly different analysis based on the capacity of the imagination to engage in blending, as described in the treatise, Book 2, Section 4. There, Hume says that impressions and passions are susceptible to an entire union, and like colors, may be blended so perfectly together that each of them may lose itself and contribute only to that uniform impression which arises from the whole. Now, colors and shades of a color are not necessarily the same thing, but if impressions can be blended like colors, and if shades of a color can also be blended since they are, after all, impressions, then it stands to reason that blending the impressions of shades 3 and 5 together could yield an impression of shade 4, from which the idea of shade 4 could then be derived. But if that really is a capacity of the imagination, and if the missing shade of blue were in fact filled in this way, it would not be a counterexample to the copy principle. This is because the idea of shade 4 would have been directly derived from a corresponding impression of shade 4, just as the copy print principle requires. It would just be an impression brought about by the blending of some nearby sense impressions rather than the usual route of original sensory input. Since I am committed to constraint B, however, I prefer the transposing augmenting method I outlined above, since it preserves the all-important contradiction. I explain why in the following section. Okay, so the author here is saying, look, you can blend these two. And then it's not exactly what was going on above, but we can assume we can blend these two. The other question is, can you somehow like take this one and say, look, what would be something in between them? You're not blending the two, but you're just trying to find something that would be close to number 3 and close to 5, but not either at the same time. And so that you could also, in some sense, do without just trying to like mix these two things together. So a different sort of mechanical process. Okie doke. One more hurdle. In the previous section, I gave an account how it would be possible to end up with the idea of shade 4, the missing shade of blue, in your mind never having actually seen shade 4 out there in the world. That is, never having the feeling and sensation of it as putatively required by Hume's general maxim concerning the relationship between impressions and ideas. What I haven't done is explain A, what purpose Hume could have in including the missing shade of blue thought experiment in his essay, while also seeing it as B, genuinely contradictory phenomena to his general maxim, my two constraints. In fact, I may have only made things more difficult for myself by modeling my proposed mechanism for filling in the missing shade of blue on an example that Hume does not see as an exception to his account, namely getting to the idea of God despite not having an impression of infinite intelligence, etc., as required by the concept. In other words, by analogizing the missing shade of blue, which is supposed to be B, with the idea of God, which Hume does not see as B, I appear to have violated my second constraint. That is, if the missing shade of blue is not a contrary phenomenon, but only appears so, then it would be very strange indeed for Hume to single it out as such and have a whole aside about it in the manner we have seen. Yeah, so if it wasn't as contradictory, what was Hume going on and on about? Let me try to get out of this bind. My approach will be to identify a disanalogy between the God case and the case of the missing shade of blue, which shows that they are not in fact two tokens of the very same phenomenon. The disanalogy I have in mind is this. God is supposed to be a complex idea, whereas the missing shade of blue, shade number 4 in figure 1, is supposed to be a simple idea. Very cute, there is no shade 4 in figure 1. You have to have it in your head by now. Cutesy author. Alright. Everybody knows that on Hume's account you can get complex ideas by compounding, transposing, augmenting, or diminishing the material afforded by us, the senses, and experience. So the idea of God is not counterexample to anything. By contrast, simple ideas such as a single shade of a given color are supposed to be copied from a present feeling or sentiment, as it were directly. So the missing shade of blue is a counterexample to the main doctrine Hume put forward, and thus the mystery still remains. Okay, so it's a different sort of thing, a color shade versus a complex idea such as God. So if you are to have but then you'd still say, well, why can't we, if we are only supposed to directly sort of experience these sort of colors then, and the God is too complex, we're not supposed to directly experience God in the same way, then we still have the problem with missing shade of blue. Alright, so they're different sorts of things, I suppose. Alright, so author says, this is not a universally accepted interpretation, as Garrett argues. Sympathetic critics have sometimes suggested that Hume could easily have avoided the treating the missing shade of blue as a counterexample to the copy principle by treating all shades of color instead as complex ideas. But there are two problems with this suggestion. First, it would violate my second constraint, so I at least cannot avail myself of this maneuver. And second, it seems hard to support with Hume's own words. In the treatise, Book 1, Part 1, Section 1, for example, Hume distinguishes between complex ideas and simple ideas in a way that appears to exclude the possibility of colors being complex. Simple perceptions or impressions and ideas are such as admit of no distinction nor separation. The complex are the contrary to these and may be distinguished into parts. Though a particular color, taste, and smell are qualities all united together in this apple, it is easy to perceive that they are not the same, but are at least distinguishable from each other. The suggestion here seems to be that the particular color of the apple, like its particular taste and smell, are simple ideas. the distinguishable parts out of which the complex idea of the apple is made up, but which cannot themselves be distinguished into any simpler parts. Okay, a plausible explanation. Let us go ahead and assume then that the missing shade of blue is indeed a simple idea, but one that has not been derived from an immediate precedent impression. Oh, yeah. Why would Hume bring up a counterexample to his copy principle, and how could he be justified, if indeed he can be justified, contra procere et al., in failing to revise his central doctrine? Callahan proposes a dialectical mismatch between Hume and his imagined reader that could explain his bringing up the missing shade of blue. As she writes, Hume is trying to lay out a complicated theoretical apparatus that he will use to explain human experience, but he has not yet got all the pieces on the table. Meanwhile, his reader is understandably hung up on the phenomenology of experience and might be imagining something like the missing shade of blue. In tentatively conceding the case, Callahan suggests it is as though Hume is saying, I understand why you think that, but just wait until we get to a vantage point from which we can see both theory and phenomena explained clearly and fully. Alright, so this is kicking the can down the road. Which is just conceding the point. Now, Callahan does not think Hume saw his missing shade of blue as a genuine counterexample to his theory, for reasons she discusses at length in her paper, where we have been assuming that he did, for reasons discussed in a previous section. But her invocation of an imagined reader is helpful for our purposes. It invites us to think of Hume going about his writing with a hypothetical interlocutor in mind, one who might, when confronted with a challenge to produce the idea which would refute the universal application of the copy principle, actually set about trying to do so. And by putting himself in the position of this imagined individual, it might be the case that Hume, however, inadvertently just happened to come up with such an idea. In other words, it might be the case that he mentions the missing shade of blue because it occurred to him. That is, when thinking about possible exceptions to his view. By choosing to include it in his discussion, then he could be seen as anticipating and openly acknowledging a critical thought his reader might be having, and even conceding that it is a genuine counterexample, while dealing with it by saying, in essence, don't worry about it, it is such a singular instance, we can set it aside. Yeah, this is the bite the bullet theory of writing. If you make a mistake, you admit it, and you you run with the mistake. Like I said, if you're going to read philosophy, everyone thinks they've solved problems and done something really good, or most people seem to. It seems a little naive, frankly, to me. We all try to do the best work we can, but none of us fix everything, so it's just like, at some point you're going to have to just be like, don't worry about it, it's the best we can do right now. So, but readers clearly have worried about it rather insistently for generations, and many of them have wondered how Hume could be so bold and even unscientific as to explicitly raise an exception to his supposed universal principle only to wave it away without a second thought. How can I defend Hume against such worries? One aspect of the defense is easy. It concerns the charge of being unscientific. If I am right that the missing shade of blue occurred to Hume and that it struck me as a genuine counterexample to his theory, it would have been unscientific of him not to mention it. Indeed, such an omission would have been contrary to the empiricist spirit of his body of work, which self-consciously attempts to model the methods of moral philosophy on those of the natural sciences. Burying inconvenient data is not allowed by such a spirit. But then why didn't Hume revise his theory? I will answer this by way of a further question. What does a natural scientist possessed of a compelling theory, one that is supported in so many ways by the convergence of careful reflection and an abundance of observation, one that seems to explain a very wide range of seemingly disparate phenomena, do when she encounters a singular phenomena that does not seem to square with the theory? Does she abandon the theory, taking it as meaningfully refuted by that single apparently contradictory case? No, she does not, nor should she. Especially if the core of the theory remains undisturbed by the seeming anomaly, though she should certainly record it as a potential exception to the rule, she should not just abandon her broader theory, nor even necessarily substantially revise it. Here is Hume in the treatise making a similar point. I quote at length. In judging the actions of men, we must proceed upon the same maxims, as when we reason concerning external objects. When any phenomenon are constantly and invariably conjoined together, they acquire such a connection in the imagination that it passes from one to the other without any doubt or hesitation. But below this there are many inferior degrees of evidence and probability, nor does one single contrariety of experiment entirely destroy all our reasoning. The mind balances the contrary experiment, and deducting the inferior from the superior proceeds with that degree of assurance or evidence which remains. We cannot conclude anything from the one irregularity which will not follow equally from the other. As Winkler, Personal Correspondence, has noted, Hume would have encountered a similar attitude in passage in Berkeley's The New Theory of Vision, where Berkeley is quoting and translating Isaac Barrow, Newton's predecessor in the Lucasian chair in natural philosophy at Cambridge. In this passage, as translated by Berkeley, Barrow has just acknowledged a difficulty facing his theory of optics. But as for me, neither this nor any other difficulty shall have so great an influence on me as to make me renounce that which I know to be manifestly agreeable to reason, especially when, as it here falls out, the difficulty is founded on the peculiar nature of a certain odd and particular case. For in the present case something particular lies hid, which being involved in the subtlety of nature will perhaps hardly be discovered till such time as the manner of vision is more perfectly made known. Concerning which, I must own, I have hitherto been able to find nothing that has the least show of probability, not to mention certainty. I shall therefore leave this knot to be untied by you, wishing you may have better success in it than I have had. Yep, it's like, may the future generations do better than I have. In other words, when faced with contrary experiment, or an odd and particular empirical case, a responsible scientist does not throw out all her positive evidence for an inductive generalization and start over. Instead, she notes the disagreeable datum, considers whether it threatens the core of her theory, and if it does not, she moves ahead with the theory so long as it continues to bear fruit. There's, of course, stuff from modern philosophy of science or contemporary philosophy of science. You get the Lakatos, that basically, how does a scientific theory really deal with contradictions? You can always make up some ad hoc stuff to build in more and more stuff into the theory. And so one contradiction, it may actually get solved, or you can always just protect yourself. It's in some sense when the weight of the contradictions overwhelm the theory, that something you have to go to something new that doesn't have all that sort of baggage with it. And so in some sense, the question is the weight of that contradiction for Hume so great as to overturn his theory? And then in that case, you're doing this sort of theory choice is what is going on here. How do you choose what theory is? Because all of them are going to have problems. All of them. Okay. She does not do this wantonly, however. Rather, she remains mindful that her theory may yet need to be revised someday, especially if the apparently anomalous case turns out to not to be so anomalous upon further careful reflection and observation, even if such revision takes place after she is dead. As Hume writes in section 1 of the Enquiry, where significantly he sets the stage for his entire project. The motive of blind despair can never reasonably have a place in the sciences. Since, however unsuccessful former attempts may have proved, there is still room to hope that the industry, good fortune, or improved sagacity of succeeding generations may reach discoveries unknown to former ages. Even adventurous genius will still leap at the arduous prize and find himself stimulated, rather than discouraged, by the failures of his predecessors. Yep. So may future generations do better than I have. May you all do better than I have. Conclusion. Hume's theory, I claim, can tolerate little failure, especially since the scientific phenomenon it apparently fails to explain, that is, the missing shade of blue, and analogous cases, is indeed plausibly singular. As Jerlin suggests, the phenomena is particular and singular because the idea produced is a simple idea of a member of a special sort of series, a series of simple sensibles such as a shade of the same hue that differ from one another only by degree. Although the number of series is of this sort, and so the number of exceptions to Hume's principle is presumably large, one could still argue that few, if any, such ideas are actually produced before their corresponding impressions, and, more importantly, the ideas Hume later attacks, for example, the idea of necessary connection of substance of the self, are not members of this group. Indeed, the phenomena in question is relatively easy to harmonize with this theory's central core. What is that core? It is, in short, as Hume puts it, the notion that all materials of thinking are derived either from outward or inward sentiment. expressed like that, and given the filling in mechanism I proposed above, it would still be correct to say that the idea of the missing shade of blue was derived from a basic sentiment, namely the impressions from which the idea of the immediate adjacent shade of blue was copied. Okay. Yeah. So this is interesting because they're basically defaulting to that, saying, look, it's a default to theory choice here, and there's always going to be, once you are defaulting to like theory choice concepts, then you're going to be weighing evidence of theories, not the particular theory, but multiple theories, and all the different theories have problems. We don't have like the particularly, like, we don't have the one true theory. And so if you're going to be choosing theories, then what you're going to have to be doing is weighing the problems. And Hume saying, look, this theory is great because the problem here is so minor and silly and little or peculiar that it's as not to be worrisome. Like, anyone should be willing to bite this bullet. It's so undangerous compared to all the other ones. Sure, in the future we may do better, but he's saying, look, my theory is so good because this is so little of a problem. Now, of course, people in the future will be like, well, we have more options, more theories, and so it becomes a lot easier to go to some other theory, but that's only in hindsight does that become the case. So I'm just wondering if there was what did exactly Hume say? Let's see. From moment to supplies deficiency, you raise up the idea of particular shade. If you can may sort of proof. Huh. And then what I want to see is this instance of singular is scarcely worth observing, and does not merit for that. It alone should alter our general maxim. Yes, he is a theory choice over here is really what's going on. That for it alone, we should alter our general maxim. So I think this is what the author here is saying, is that Hume is not making a general case, a specific claim about this argument, but general theory choice claim here, and that is why this contradiction, though Hume recognizes it and notes it carefully in more than one place, as the author pointed out, it doesn't really make a difference. Now, here's the question. I mean, I was just thinking maybe we could have some sort of error theory here, where it's like, look, you've got this, where are the colors? Where are the colors at? There's the colors. Like, our perception is not so, singular. It's not like you and I see the exact same colors. I know my eyes see slightly different colors. If you don't believe that your eyes see different colors, you can close one eye and stare at something like, there's like illusions on the internet. You can like close one eye and you can stare at something, and what happens is the cones in your eye get tired out. And so then you open the other eye and your brain sort of like tries to auto-correct the colors, so one eye won't see the right colors, one eye will see different colors, and by doing so, it like you can get like an illusion of a colored image, of colors that aren't there. So it's like we've got like error theory in our brain is correcting for this. So the idea that we even if we've never seen number 4 here, the idea that we've seen exactly 3 and exactly 5 is wrong. Also, like we've seen kind of like 3 and kind of like 5, so that would already give a blur theory of 4. So I wonder if there might just be more resources available to us nowadays to get these things. Say, well, we never really didn't see it. We just have the artificial breaking up of the missing shade. That would be attacking the problem there. I'd say there is no missing shade. It's because we never had shades. Shades are artificial categories. Oh yeah, that's just a first pass thought at the problem. Okay, does anyone else have any questions out there? Please let me know from the audience. Otherwise, I'll be back tonight with another paper. This was kind of fun. I haven't read anything on Hume in a while. Journal of Scottish Philosophy. Thank you very much, and have a good day, and stay safe, everyone out there. Really, it's getting a little, times are bad in America. They were not good before, but they're getting a little worrisome now. Have a good day.